Welcome, everybody. It's so excited to have you in class today. My name is Curry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'm very excited to host this great class today all about the Fourth Amendment. If you haven't joined a Friday session before, this is our Friday Fun Day class where we get to bring in some of the best and brightest in the field doing the real work on this constitutional content. And today we are so excited to have Commissioner Ramsey with us. Now, a little bit of information about Commissioner Ramsey for students before we get started, because we are going to be taking questions from you, where you can put that in the chat or the Q&A. So Commissioner Ramsey, he was the former DC Chief of Police and the former commissioner of the Philadelphia Police Department, and he co-chaired the President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. He is one of the best names in law enforcement because not only does he have 48 years of experience being in law enforcement, he really fully understands the Constitution and its practicality for all the people in America. He's been a great friend to the center and helped us build a police training on the meaning of fairness and justice in America that trains Philadelphia police recruits and Camden, New Jersey police officers on that meaning and the history of America over time. My kind of favorite fun fact about you, Commissioner Ramsey, that I read today that I wanted to share with the students is that you started your career when you were 18 years old in Chicago, and that was in 1968. So all week long, we've been talking about Fourth Amendment in different time periods. And today, we're so excited to hear your perspectives and your ideas on it and your lived experience on policing in America and the Fourth Amendment over some of those time periods. Now, to do all this great work, we're with our chief scholar at the National Constitution Center, Jeffrey Rosen. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it over for you for this great conversation.
Thank you so much, Curry, and welcome, Chief Ramsey. We're always so honored every time we can have a conversation with you at the National Constitution Center. Thank you for your service to America, to Philadelphia, to DC, and all the light you're shining on the role of the police in our society. I thought I'd jump right in to help our students understand how you teach the Fourth Amendment to your officers when you train them. The Fourth Amendment, of course, regulates the way that the police can interact with people on the street or in their homes or in their cars. It says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be warranted. When you have police training on the Fourth Amendment, which I know all police officers go through, share with our friends in the chat, what are some of the big ideas about the Fourth Amendment that you try to teach your officers?
Well, thanks. First of all, it's really an honor to be with you all, and it's good to see you again, Jeffrey. So, in police training, there are two amendments to the Constitution that get the majority of the attention, and that's the First and the Fourth. Obviously, the first with, basically as it relates a lot to crowd control, crowd management, protests, things of that nature. And of course, the Fourth Amendment, which impacts police on a more frequent basis, actually, when it comes to dealing with, taking people into custody, making car stops, executing warrants, things of that nature. Now, a lot's happened since 1968, obviously, when I first started, and a lot of it has to do with various court decisions regarding the Fourth Amendment. So the training is always evolving to stay abreast of what's current in terms of what police officers are allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. But there is an awful lot of focus on Fourth Amendment. A lot of it focuses on car stops and seizure of any evidence during the course of that, plain view, what the areas in the immediate control of an offender, does that include a locked glove box, for an example? They have scenarios that play out with that. The trunk of the car, that's fairly obvious. But when you start getting into some of these other areas, that's where a lot of the discussion takes place. When should you get a warrant? And one of the things that the academies that I went through, a lot of the conversation was err on the side of getting a warrant. If in doubt, secure it, get a warrant. Then you don't have any issues later on when it comes to the seizing of any evidence. And so that's basically what goes on in police academies. It's certainly nothing like you get in law school, but it's more practical. It's more It deals more with the kinds of things that you would encounter on the street. Now, I worked narcotics for a lot of years in Chicago, so I dealt with search warrants on a regular basis. And of course, officers coming into narcotics, we actually put on a different training for them around all the requirements for obtaining a search warrant. So yeah, the Fourth Amendment plays a significant role in policing, obviously.
That's just a great introduction to the practicalities of teaching the Fourth Amendment. Maybe if you're up for it, why don't we go through a scenario about some of the things that you mentioned. If the police are following a car on the street, under what circumstances they can stop you and what parts of the car they can search. When I teach criminal procedure at GW Law School, I do it from the point of view of the citizen. But you can help us understand it from the point of view of the policeman. So I don't know, you can construct the hypo better than I can, but let's imagine I'm driving along and I break a traffic regulation. I turn without signaling. Are you allowed as an officer to stop me? Can you tell me to get out of the car? What part of the car can you search? Kind of take me through the whole encounter.
Well, I mean, you'd be allowed to stop the car if there is a violation, but there needs to be a violation. You can't just stop a person. It gets into the driving while black or any other types of reasons that really aren't any kind of violation of the law. You could stop an individual if you have reasonable suspicion or probable cause to believe that they're involved in something. Let's say you're on patrol and there was a robbery that took place at a gas station and they describe a blue Chevrolet, 2020. Blue Chevrolet occupied by two males, and you see blue Chevrolet matching the description with two males, leaving the scene. That would give you justification to make the stop. Now that becomes a felony car stop, okay? Versus you just didn't use your directional signal to make a turn. Two totally different circumstances under which you could stop an individual. If you make a stop that's a felony stop, you believe this person could be the subject wanted in an armed robbery, then yeah, your approach to the car would be totally different. Getting them out of the car, doing a protective search, those kinds of things would take place. For a regular traffic violation, no. In fact, we actually tell people to stay in their car, to not get out of the car, stay in the car. And again, would you search a car like that? No, I mean, if you saw an AK-47 laying on the seat next to the person, that's different. But, the odds of that happening are very, very remote. But on a felony car stop, you would stop the individual, you'd get them out, you would do a protective search. Now, that's where it gets a little dicey. Once they're out of the car, they no longer have control over what's in the car, right? If you discover that they are, in fact, the people that committed the robbery, that's where a supervisor would probably tell you, secure the car, right? Keep a guard on it, get a warrant. And then you can search the car, and then any proceeds from the robbery, gun used in a robbery, anything like that, you won't have any problems with it being admissible in court because the person is no longer in the car. They don't have direct access or control of anything in the car, so you're not worried about weapons and whatever.
One of our friends asked, do you think too much policing involves car stops for generally minor offenses, broken light, failing to signal and so forth? And to pick up on that, if you do stop me for broken light or failure to signal, you have the power to tell me to get out of the car if for the officer's safety. And then, as you said, if you see the AK-47 in plain view, obviously, then you can get that. But don't you still have some pretty broad power to search the car? And if anything looks suspicious, tell us under what circumstances you could even search the trunk or the glove compartment.
Well, I mean, there's a consent to search. If a person, if you ask the question, you mind if I search your car? And a person says yes and gives you consent, then that's a consent search, okay? And that's permissible. Now, even that's come under fire because people, have claimed, well, I was coerced, I really didn't give consent, and so forth. I mean, now that officers wear body cameras, for an example, that would be relatively easy to determine the circumstances under which permission was given. But back in my day, before body cameras and so forth, that was always something that really was oftentimes problematic. Again, the way I always approached it, unless you have a real reason to feel that there's something there that you need to be able to check to see if it's a weapon or something like that. Anything short of that for mere traffic offense, either give a warning or write a ticket, and that's it.
What you mentioned Supreme Court decisions since 1968. Of course, one of the big ones, as you always teach your recruits, was the Terry versus Ohio, which gives officers the power to stop folks on reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing rather than probable cause, and then to do a protective search. Tell us about that and some of the other really big decisions that have changed the law of search over the past, 50 years or whatever it is.
You know, Terry stops, when I first started, Terry versus Ohio was a relatively new Supreme Court decision. So a lot of time was spent on it. And we even referred to it as Terry stops. Whenever you made a pedestrian stop or anything like that, it was referred to as a Terry stop. Over the years, it kind of morphed into something called stop and frisk. Okay. And I think that's where police started getting in trouble, where, you know, we kind of got away from the very basics of what really justifies a Terry stop. Call it that, write it up that way, and make sure that officers are only making stops with the reasonable suspicion they need to believe that a person committed a crime or is about to commit a crime or what have you. It's morphed into stop and frisk. A lot of that came as a result of some of the tactics being used in some cities, which I will not name, but one in particular, a very large city, where that became something that they did on a regular basis. First of all, frisking an individual isn't automatic. I mean, you pat down on their garments if you believe that person's carrying a weapon. You stop and question, but frisk is not automatic. But if necessary, fine, then you do the pat down. But it's important. In fact, when I was in Philly, I made sure that in our academy, we didn't even use the term stop and frisk, Terry stops. And you train that way. That's the way you teach. And that's the way you make sure that officers are being held accountable for making constitutional stops, because that's what it's all about, constitutional policing. And in many cases, officers make a stop. They have reasonable suspicion, but they're terrible writers and they do not articulate the reason for the stop. And so when you review it 6 months later, you say, oh, this was a bad stop. I fault the supervisor who signed off on that, because you have to spend time training your sergeants, who are the first line supervisors that review these documents. If an officer has an incomplete, or they did it wrong, and maybe they didn't have reasonable suspicion when they made the stop, that's where it has to be dealt with. Right there, that day by that supervisor. So we allowed ourselves to get into this whole stop and frisk thing. And it took us away from the reason why, it is constitutional to be able to make a stop under certain circumstances, but you have to be able to articulate that. And I do believe it needs to be audited on a regular basis to make sure that your officers are doing it properly.
That's a very powerful insight from you, who know very well how this operates on the ground. Should the court have regulated stop and frisk more precisely with constitutional doctrine, or should legislatures or other regulatory bodies regulate stop and frisk?
I think most states have a police officer standards and training board. That's where it starts, I think, by mandating certain training in police academies. And that's why there needs to be national standards, which is a whole different, conversation. But there are some very basic fundamental things that need to be incorporated in all police training on a regular basis, with refreshers and all that sort of thing. And where you challenge officers with different scenarios, some based in court cases, either at the state or federal level, and some just from incidents that you see out there on the street as to whether or not, is this a justifiable stop? If so, why? If not, why not? And really challenge on a regular basis so that officers understand the circumstances under which they can make a pedestrian stop, vehicle stop, whatever it is, so that they're doing it and doing it properly. The one area, though, that's not in the law, but is the reason why police get in a lot of trouble when they make these stops, I think, because I read the complaints from people, it's the disrespect that's given toward the person who was stopped. Sometimes people understand why they're stopped, but the cop sometimes doesn't bother to explain why, or they're just rude. And that is what generates a lot of the complaints that I wind up, at least when I was the commissioner, that I would have to, I would see come across my desk. It was the behavior of the officer, not really the stop. That was the issue. And I'm not trying to say that it's not important to stop in the circumstances under which you stop isn't important. But I'm saying that it's more than just what a Supreme Court or any law can demand. It's the behavior and the attitude of the officer that has to be part of the training and the expectation that's placed on that officer when they're interacting with the public. You can't put that in a law. You must smile or you must do whatever, right? That's something that we have to make sure that our officers do, because it's more than just the legal aspect of it. There's another dimension.
That is such a powerful statement. You're absolutely, it's dignity that people care about. They don't want to be
Exactly.
disrespected. And
Exactly
dignity
right.
is not something, as you say, that the Constitution clearly protects. Do you find ways in your training of teaching officers to behave
Yes.
respectfully?
Yeah, one of the things we started doing in Philadelphia in our training, and I'll go back to the felony car stop. You get the BOLO, be on the lookout, is what that stands for. You know, the blue Chevy, armed robbery, blah blah blah. So you make a stop, and it's a legitimate stop, right? You got this is a flash message that came out, but you stop and you realize after a period of time it's the wrong blue Chevy. These guys they got nothing to do with this case. You know, GM made more than one blue Chevy when they produced them. So, you know, now the circumstances have changed. So not only do we have a trainer that's watching the car stop from the perspective of tactics and did they do it properly, positioning the car and all that sort of thing. Now there's another person who is there to do one thing and one thing only. And that is to listen to the exchange between the officer and the driver, who is irate, not real happy with the fact that he got stopped, to see how well that officer can de-escalate, how well that officer can then explain what's going on, you know, and really challenge that skill set that not everybody has, quite frankly, but they need to have. And so not only are you checking to make sure that they're doing things properly from a tactical perspective, how effective are they at de-escalating a situation when you know, at some point in time, you realize I got the wrong guy, right? Well, you just don't walk away. You know, how do you deal with it now when you've got a person now that's upset, and understandably so, because they know they didn't do it, right? You're just finding out they didn't do it. So they're upset and they got a right to be a little upset. So how do you de-escalate?
That is very powerful. And that answers Dana Bennett's question. Are officers trained in how to speak and de-escalate a person who's scared and defensive? A whole bunch of questions, of course, about the effect of the huge debate we're having in this country post George Floyd about police encounters with citizens. How has that changed the way the police are willing to make car stops and encounters? And do you think the law is or should evolve as a result?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, but it's one that's kind of tough to answer. There are many officers now who are reluctant to make a stop of any kind with reasonable suspicion, because they don't want to be on the next viral video, or they're just afraid to do that, right? And so that's a problem, especially when you have rising crime rates, especially gun violence and things of that nature. So trying to find that balance, one, motivate your people. If you're doing a job and doing it properly, then, you know, you're protected. Nobody's gonna, you know, you're not gonna wind up in any trouble if you're doing a job properly, doing it right. You know, if you're violating people's rights, then obviously you can expect to have a problem. Okay. And so, you know, having that balance where officers can do their jobs but at the same time do it in a constitutional fashion. I don't think, you know, the two go hand in hand. You know, you can have crime reduction and constitutional policing at the same time. There are those that think that one has a negative impact on the other. And I would argue very strongly that's not the case at all. Just the opposite, actually. I think we'll be more successful the better officers, engage in only those activities that really fall within that framework of the Constitution. So that's a very, very good question. There are some things this is just me, and I'm certainly not a law professor or anything like that. There are some things in terms of policing that laws just can't fix, because a lot of it has to do with just behavior. And a lot of it has to do with how officers approach their job. You know, I mean, so some of the stuff, to me, it really kind of gets at that. That's where leadership, supervision, all those kinds of things really kind of play in. And you can't fix that through a city council or a state legislature or Supreme Court even. Some of that just comes to human interaction and how officers approach and how they do their job, and understand why it's important they do it the proper way. You know, the Constitution is all of our Constitution. It's not just your Constitution because I'm a cop. It's not, right? It protects you too. And so you have to see it that way. And if you see it that way, then you'll conduct yourself in a manner that's consistent with what's required of the Constitution.
You're so right that it's all of our Constitution, and it does come down to how officers do the job. And it's such a tough problem as we talk about it. When I taught Crim Pro a couple of years ago, an officer told me he had the Mr. Donut rule. He thought if the law didn't allow him to do whatever he needed to protect himself and his officers, he just wouldn't get into the situation at all. He'd go and have a donut. So are you are you concerned that officers may be, reluctant to do what they should do and protect folks if they're afraid of getting filmed or getting pushback? And there's obviously no easy answer, but how would you cultivate officers having the right answer at a time when there's huge mistrust of their encounters with citizens?
Well, I mean, the mistrust also exists between the rank and file and the leaders of departments, the bosses, the supervisors. There's not a lot of trust there. We talk about procedural justice and things like that as it relates to how we treat the public. Well, there needs to be internal procedural justice too, because, police officers don't feel like anybody's got their back at all. And having your back isn't when you do something wrong. You have to be held accountable, but it's so that you don't, if you do your job and you're doing it properly, you still wind up getting in trouble. And we have to do a better job of really reinforcing and supporting our people when they do the job right, but then hold those that don't accountable, because the other cops, they don't want to be around bad cops. They don't want to be around the Derek Chauvins of the world and stuff like that, I mean, and so, that's a balancing act, but right now it is having an impact. There's no question about that. There are some police officers that just aren't being very proactive, and we don't want to get back into that notion of just being report takers, where something happens, you call 911, we come take a report after the fact. I mean, if you can prevent something from happening, then why wouldn't you want to do that? I mean, you don't want a person to become a victim if you can in any way prevent it from occurring. So there does need to be some proactive police work out there. That's not every officer, but there are some that I know are more reluctant than others.
How much has the phenomenon of videoing encounters changed the nature of the encounters? Are police afraid that little snippets of the encounter are going to be taken out of context? And one of our friends asked, under what circumstances can the officers take your cell phone and prevent you from recording?
Well, they can't take your cell phone and prevent you from recording, first of all. Okay, you have a right to record. Now, you can't interfere with the arrest. So there is a limit to that. In other words, you can't get within, 12 inches of an individual and try to get a close-up or something like that. But it can't stop you from filming. You have a right to do that, okay? As far as video goes, it's kind of strange. When we started a pilot program in Philadelphia, in North Philadelphia, our 22nd district, which is unfortunately usually tends to lead the city every year in terms of violent crime. And I thought, if we're going to pilot it anywhere, let's pilot it there, because any issues that are going to come up is going to come up there versus some slower district, right? So we got volunteers and we put cameras, different manufacturers, because part of what I had them do was evaluate all these cameras so we knew which ones to buy. But we got volunteers. They warned. It was about a 6-month pilot. Now, there was a lot of skepticism in the beginning, believe me. Now, I don't want to be wearing a camera, blah, 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 blah. When the pilot was over and we decided on, we were going to purchase and start rolling it out department-wide, members of the 22nd district, which is the district that piloted, said, listen, we should get some special consideration since we piloted it. We want to be the very first to be fully equipped with the cameras, because they started to see that it also protects them against frivolous complaints because it's on camera. And so it cuts both ways. Where I have a problem with the little snippets is really more with the media and with others that only want to show that part that looks bad. And believe me, if you're talking use of force is not a pretty thing to see. This is not television. It's not pretty, okay? And so when only you show that part, not what led up to it, maybe not even what happened after. They recently had an officer-involved shooting where an officer shot an individual, the guy was armed, shot him, and after he shot him and they secured the gun, he immediately first aid, did chest compressions, did everything. I mean, extraordinary efforts to try to save his life. That was never shown. Now, I saw it when I watched the full video, and I actually challenged one of the media folks to say, you at least show that part. You just show the one little snippet and people draw whatever conclusion. Oh, why do you have to shoot him? Well, it's always tragic and it's always unfortunate whenever you have to use force against anybody, but show the whole thing. And so I think sometimes it does a disservice when you just get these little 10-second bits and pieces. Some of these things are just unjustified and bad, but there are others that once you see it, and I'm not talking specifically just about shootings, just use of force in general, then you start to see exactly what transpired, what took place, what caused. Then you can make a judgment as to whether or not that use of force was necessary, was it reasonable, and was it proportional. But you need to see everything in order to make that kind of judgment, which is what it needs to be based on.
One of my sons is in ninth grade, and he's taken it on himself to watch the whole video. Whenever something gets into the news, he wants to see the whole thing himself so he can make up his own mind. Is that a good idea for citizens to do?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is. Listen, it is what it is. If it's bad, it's bad. But if it's not, at least have some way of being able to make a judgment, but not based on just, a 10-second soundbite. You do a lot of interviews. If someone just took a 5-second snippet of a hour-long conversation and said, this is Jeffrey Rosen, right? I mean, there's no context, no nothing, right? I mean, that's a problem. And so it's the same thing with videos. And I think we all need to be responsible when it comes to that. Some of the behaviors of officers are bad. And I'm not trying to justify that. But I do think that the public ought to at least have the ability to see the entire video, not just that one little part of it.
I'm always so reluctant to give back the mic to Curry, and I'm not going to quite do it yet because this is such an important time we have with you. But I want to ask, what are the big legal and constitutional issues that courts and legislatures are going to be deciding in the next couple of years? We got a huge national debate about the difference between, reasonable suspicion and profiling. We've got this driving while black, very serious concern. What are the kind of court cases and constitutional issues we should all be looking out for?
Well, qualified immunity is another one. That's a very hot topic right now. And, here's my fear. And I do think that all these things need to be very closely examined. But I don't think it ought to be a knee-jerk response either to anything that happens to be going on at the moment. They need to be thoughtful decisions that are made when it comes to that. Now, there needs to be reform in policing. There needs to be reform in the entire criminal justice system as far as I am concerned. And I think one of the dangers is trying to just look at one part of it and not look at the entire system and then think you've somehow fixed things, because you haven't. The entire system needs to be reviewed and overhauled when needed and when necessary. But there are a lot of things that are going on now. My fear, though, especially as it relates to local and state legislatures, and even our US Congress, unfortunately, things are done so quickly now. I don't think there's enough thought. I don't think they bring the right people to the table to have thoughtful discussion. I think everything has gotten extreme left or extreme right. There's no effort to even try to find a balance. And that's a problem to me. That is a problem. And that's not to say there isn't a need for change. There is a need for change, but what should that change look like that doesn't compromise, safety and security of people, that allows people to do their jobs, but do it properly? I mean, what's the balance there? And I fear that we're moving down a path that the outcome, there are going to be unintended consequences, I'll say it. But some of the actions that I have seen people discussing.
Such a powerful warning that the moderate solutions that thoughtful people can in fact embrace, and that you helped identify in your task force with President Obama, may not be adopted because of the extreme polarization and extreme suggestions on the right and the left. Well, to the degree that the Constitution Center can play any role in helping to convene thoughtful people to talk with you about what those good solutions would be, or just to have discussions like this one, we are honored to do that because it is
Well,
such
yeah, and there's so many things, and even, I mean, yeah, but there are issues that need to be discussed that haven't become huge issues yet, and technology has a lot to do with that. Okay, I mean, drone technology, for an example, facial recognition. I mean, all these kinds of things. These are issues that need to be discussed up front. Policies and training need to be put in place. But it needs to be done so that if police are going to use this technology, which I believe they should be able to use it, but use it within a constitutional framework. Don't wait until somebody screws it up and then have it go to the Supreme Court and then have a court decision come down. Why can't we be proactive and do it right before it even gets to that point?
What a great suggestion. And I know Curry's waiting, but I'm not gonna give up yet because this is so interesting. Just take the big constitutional question of the past 5 years. Can the police follow you 24/7 for a month, reconstructing your cell phone data or using a GPS device? Basically, the court has said no, that you can't do that for a month. But they haven't said how long you can be followed for or how serious the crime has to be before you can do a month-long data search. You're telling us that departments should decide that up front and have policies rather than just leaving it up to the justices.
But the department should do it up front, but the ACLU should be at the table, legal scholars should be at the table, police officials should be, all the right people should be at the table to talk about it and design whatever that policy and training ought to look like. It shouldn't be just be police doing it.
Yeah.
Who are the right people that need to be at the table? Because there are real issues. I mean, what if it was, obviously he's dead, but what if it was Osama bin Laden you're following? I mean, would you tell me that I can only do it for 24 hours? I don't think you'd want that, right? And so, there are going to be some extraordinary circumstances that are going to occur that's going to really kind of, fly in the face of whatever ruling comes down. But if we have these discussions up front, and if we set that bar and say, in order to do it beyond this, you need to have X, Y, Z, let's have that discussion now before the case even exists.
Well, we've just set our next panel discussion, and we would be so honored if you'd consider joining, some good ACLU folks and some police officers and technologists, and at least having a discussion about what those rules would look like, because it's crucially important, as you say. All right, I think just because Curry, our friends have so many questions, and so does Curry, with great reluctance, I'm going to turn it back over to her. Take it away, Curry.
I can shut off his camera if I had to.
Well,
I have that
the camera
power.
will still follow you.
So Gianna wants to know if officers are trained in race relations and if they've been trained in being aware of biases. I thought it was a brilliant question from one of our students.
It is, and there's training now. One training in particular is called Fair and Impartial Policing, and it really focuses on the fact, and it starts off in an interesting way, and that is that everybody has a bias of some kind. Everybody doesn't have to be racial, doesn't have to be whatever, but we all have biases, right? At some point in time in our life, the key is to understand what it is and not let it influence how you do your job. And I think that, that is another example of where the state training boards need to make that kind of training mandatory. But along with that, I think needs to be something that the Constitution Center is doing that needs to be nationwide. And that is teach the history of policing in the United States. Because if you understand the history of policing, which is not always, when you look at policing, and I'm old enough to have grown up through the civil rights era and so forth. I mean, police have not always stood on the right side of justice as we define justice today. And that's why we have to teach the history, because we're not hiring 70-year-old cops, 70-year-old cops. We're hiring 20-year-old cops. They were alive then. But they need to understand, why is it that there's more tension in some communities versus others? And it's the history, it's the baggage that the profession carries with it. You can't fix it and overcome it if you aren't even aware of it. And so, yeah, we need training around bias. We need training around all those kinds of things. But we also need to incorporate history as part of our training, so officers understand the why. Why is it that there are communities that look at you with suspicion? I mean, it's not just, I mean, it's not as if it's for no reason, right? And you need to know that.
And that kind of leads to the next question that I was like kind of pulling from the students. When you understand why, you have a tendency to empathize with people and understand where they're coming from. So how much should we connect the empathy of understanding communities and each other with equal protection under the law?
Well, I mean, to me, it goes hand in hand. And you know, to me, you know, to understand the shoes that someone else, you know, are walking in, I think is essential. We all grow up, and especially if you're in a big city. You grew up on one side of the town. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. My first assignment was on the west side of Chicago. I remember having to get a street map to find my way around. I had no idea. I had never gone on the west side of Chicago. It's a big city, right? I grew up in a whole different area. But to understand people that have different life experience, different ways of doing things, I mean, I think it's essential. One of the things we started in Philly with new recruits is we put them on foot patrol rather than put them in a car right away. And I mean neighborhood foot patrol, right in the middle of neighborhoods that have a lot of crime and disorder occurring in public space. And the reason is, one, it did have an impact. Temple did a study and showed it had an impact. But more importantly to me, it taught them a valuable lesson. There are more decent law-abiding people living in that community than there are criminals. You don't know that when you're driving down the street at 30 miles an hour in a car. You do know it when you're out there walking on the street. You get to know the people, get to know the kids. You get to understand a little bit more about what's going on in that neighborhood. If all you're doing is jump from one 911 call to another, then it's easy to become jaded. And it's easy to get that impression that the whole neighborhood, oh, this is a bad neighborhood. Oh, these are a number of criminals, blah, blah, blah. That's going to influence your behavior. It's going to influence how you interact with people. It's going to, you know, how you treat folks and everything else. Understanding and having empathy, because us fate and circumstances is the only thing that separates us in life anyway. I mean, I've been times in my life, I was a paycheck away from sleeping on that same bench that homeless guy is sleeping on, right? And so you can't look down on anybody. You have to understand where they're coming from. You may not agree with it, and that's okay. But at least have an understanding, because even a person that commits a crime has a right to be respected, not disrespected. Just do your job.
And I think that's fantastic. And that wraps us this understanding of American history and this value of, you know, everybody's treated equal. It's the value that Jeff said earlier, like dignity. We want to have dignity in our rights, in our beliefs, in our lives. One final question from Warren, and I absolutely loved it, so I promised I'd ask him it. Have you ever been stopped by the police or pulled over? Yeah.
I got a traffic ticket when I was 17. I think I was 17. It was before I became a cadet. And I was guilty. I was speeding. And when I even pled guilty in court. I didn't even waste my time. It was one of those things where you had to appear. And I apologized, and I told the judge, you know, whatever. I forget what it was now. It was a fine or whatever. But I was guilty. But I've been fortunate that I've not had a bad encounter. Now, I didn't grow up wanting to be a police officer. I accidentally became a police officer in a very roundabout way. But I did not personally have a bad experience, but I do know that those bad experiences happen, and they happen more often than they ought to happen. And so I do understand that. Just me personally, I have not had that, but you know, I'm just fortunate.
Thank you so much. Students, I know a lot of you were asking for more resources and more from Commissioner Ramsey. I will send out his amazing brief on policing in a democratic society and the role of police. That's from a few years ago. We'll send it out in the wrap up today, but we want to thank you so much for this great conversation. It's such an important conversation we should be having more and more, because I do think the more we can come together, like you said, lots of different voices at the table having this dialogue, we can build something that really is going to be sustainable and work for us before something happens. Thank you.
And
so
thank
much.
you, Carrie, because I mean, it was Carrie and her folks that put together the Policing in a More Perfect Union from a crazy idea I had a few years ago. And I think really makes a difference. And thank you. Thank you so much for that.
It's nice to have teachers at the table too. That's what I'm going to add.
And I'll thank both Curry and you, Commissioner, for working together for that phenomenal project. And I'm just so grateful for every time we have the chance to speak with you. Thank you for educating our friends about the Constitution. And friends, have a wonderful weekend. Join me with a big virtual thank you to Chief Ramsey.
And happy Mother's Day to everyone.
Happy Mother's Day to all the
Happy
moms.
Mother's
Absolutely.
Day. Thank you, everybody. Have a great one. Thank you.